So welcome everybody to the National Social Anxiety Center Clinical Education webinar. My name is Taylor Wilmer, and I'm a National Social Anxiety Center Associate and board member based in Alexandria, Virginia. Today, we're excited to welcome Dr. Justin Weeks, who's joining us to talk about fear of positive evaluation in social anxiety. As a reminder, we're recording this webinar today, and Dr. Weeks will be presenting for the first 45 or 50 minutes or so, and then we'll have time at the end for questions. And I will also be monitoring the chat during this webinar. So if you have questions as we go, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll try and answer them along the way or answer them towards the end. So I'm excited today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Justin Weeks. Dr. Weeks is currently the co-director of the Anxiety Subspecialty Treatment Program at the Department of Psychology at Nebraska Medicine and the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. He's also the lead of psychology at Nebraska Medicine, the track director of the anxiety track of the psychology internship program at Nebraska Medicine, and the associate director of clinical training in the Department of Psychology at Nebraska Medicine. He is also currently serving as the guest editor-in-chief for a special upcoming issue of the Journal of Anxiety Disorders that will be focused on fear of positive evaluation, and that'll be released in 2025. And he also served as the guest editor-in-chief for a similar special issue of the cognitive behavior therapy on positivity impairments in social anxiety in 2012. Dr. Weeks is currently an associate editor for the Journal of Social and Clinical Psychology, and he has authored over 75 publications in peer-reviewed journals, in addition to 3 book chapters and over 80 conference presentations and posters on social anxiety and related topics. So thank you so much, Dr. Weeks, for being here, and I will pass it over to you to get us started.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Wilmer. Yeah, I just want to start by saying what an honor it is to be presenting to the National Social Anxiety Center on FPE and the bivalent fear of evaluation model of social anxiety. I'm very excited to talk, and I welcome questions and discussion. So if those come up, please feel free to either send them in the chat or just kind of, yeah, feel free to ask as we go along. I know people's cameras, a lot of them are off, but if people could use their hand features in Zoom, if anybody, I'm curious to see a show of hands in terms of like how many of you feel like you're pretty familiar with fear of positive evaluation in the bivalent model. Okay. Yeah, just wanting to get a sense of that to know. Great. Well, so for those of you who are not as familiar with it, I'm really excited to welcome you into this model. And let's see here. So I know you're all very familiar with these diagnostic criteria, but I like to put this slide up to highlight that in the DSM-5 and the DSM-5-TR, the diagnostic criteria clearly specify that there has to be a fear of negative evaluation or concern that one's anxiety is visible to others. So it doesn't mention anything about fear of positive evaluation in the diagnostic criteria for social anxiety. And yet, I'm very confident that you have all spoken with patients who are not comforted when they're going to be doing something in front of an audience. And it's like, what do people usually say to someone when they express that they're anxious about a performance that's upcoming? Usually to calm them down, they'll say that they bet that it's going to go great and that everyone's going to love it or something like that. And that doesn't really seem to calm a person with social anxiety, right? And how often do we work with patients with social anxiety who are really anxious about interacting with their boss or some other authority figure? And yet all of the interactions they may have had with them up to date may have been very positive, and they may have gotten a lot of objective support from their boss or an authority figure. How often do our social anxiety patients express angst about interacting with peers, even if they actually haven't had an example of a situation with those peers where things have seemed to go negatively, and instead it seems like things are really positive? And really just all kinds of social interactions. It's like when we're working with social anxiety patients, it seems like no matter how well things might be going, the anxiety can still be there. It can still be fueled. And so classical models of social anxiety would have found ways to explain these situations with just the dimension of fear of negative evaluation. I would say that some of these explanations are kind of circuitous. They're kind of they require some modifications to our classical kind of like understanding of how fear of negative evaluation drives social anxiety. So in some cases, it's been proposed that maybe when socially anxious patients do well at something, that it kind of raises the bar and makes it so that it's very stressful that maybe the next time they won't do well. Also, sometimes folks will say that they don't trust the positive social feedback that they receive, and therefore maybe they're anxious because they still think that they're being negatively evaluated, even though everything seems to indicate that it's a positive evaluation. And so I would suggest that by far the more parsimonious explanation is that these situations that involve positive feedback cause anxiety and stress because our socially anxious patients fear them and they fear positive evaluation itself. And so this is kind of the concept of the bivalent model is that patients don't only have fear of negative evaluation, but there's a completely distinct valence of a fear of positive evaluation. And generally what we see is that the more anxious an individual is on either valence, the more socially anxious they become. And we've done some research looking at are there individuals who only fear negative or only fear positive evaluation? And really, it seems to be the case that for the most part, patients fear both who are socially anxious. And there's about an equal number of, it's like 10% of patients will sometimes fall into like a higher category of fear of negative evaluation or a higher fear of positive evaluation. So we'll talk more about that. But does this make sense so far? Or does anyone have any questions about these two valences? Because we'll talk a lot about the meaning of this. And okay, great. And so if there is this second valence of fear of evaluation that drives social anxiety, why is it something that doesn't come up as often as fear of negative evaluation? I'd say there's two main reasons for this. One is that it is exceptionally easy to avoid positive evaluation if one is inclined to do so. All you really have to do is not stand out and in a positive way. So it's exceptionally easy to avoid positive evaluation, again, if that's what one's goal is. It is less obvious how to avoid negative evaluation because if you remain completely outside of a social situation that you fear, you might be negatively evaluated for that because you might be seen as aloof or you might be seen as not fitting in. And so I think in part it's the ease with which one can avoid the positive feedback that it doesn't come up as often because once patients learn how to avoid what they don't want to deal with, they tend to do that until we help them to do otherwise, right? The other reason I think is because there seems to be less insight into fear positive evaluation. I've had this conversation with many, many patients where I introduce this possibility of a fear positive evaluation. And a lot of times patients disagree with me conceptually. They don't think it applies to them. And it's not until we actually try to get them to place themselves in positive situations and get that positive feedback that they realize how anxiety inducing it can be for them. And so I would say it's this combination of easy to avoid positive feedback and also like a lack of insight that a lot of patients will have. And so generally you kind of have to almost get buy-in to doing these kinds of exposures before patients will entertain the idea and then they'll find them just as anxiety provoking as the ones that focus on negative evaluation, in my experience. And so this is a model that has been making a big impact on social anxiety. There have now been 3 independent literature reviews on the constructs of fear positive evaluation and the bivalent model. 2 of those have been systematic, and the most recent one by Serena Cook and colleagues at the University of Melbourne also included meta-analyses. And at that time, which was 2 or 3 years ago that this was published, there had already been about 150 studies examining fears of positive and negative evaluation in this bivalent model. And the special issue, as Dr. Wilmer noted, that I'm a co-guest editing in chief that should be released next year, early next year, is focusing on fear of positive evaluation in this bivalent model. So there's going to be lots of new information coming out about that with that. And this is truly making a global impact. So there have been peer-reviewed studies published from teams across 13 different countries so far. And as you might imagine, with that kind of spread, it's been translated into a number of languages. The ones I'm familiar with are Portuguese, Dutch, German, Turkish, Farsi, Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. And the list is growing because I've got folks reaching out to me about other translations that are in progress, and hopefully those will continue to be validated. There's been some really interesting cross-cultural work looking at how these constructs tend to like operate, if they operate differently across different cultures. And Okawa and colleagues have put forth an interesting paper that shows that there are some differences on the basis of whether one's culture is like individualistic or more collectivistic. But for the most part, we see these constructs relating to each other very similarly across all of these different cultures that have been examined thus far. So good cross-cultural kind of stability. Developmentally speaking, we see good psychometrics, fair psychometrics for these measures we use to assess fears of positive and negative evaluation, essentially from the ages of 9 and years of age and up. And one of the articles that's coming out in the special issue next year is the first child version of the FPES that's going to be published. And basically, we got some good support with that, but it actually looks like there's some room for optimization. And so I'm interested to see that continue to move forward. And oh, I also didn't mention, but we've also found that the bivalent model has been found to be factorially invariant across all of the major ethnic groups in the United States, for example. So seeing some good stability of this model, like across a lot of different circumstances. In our clinic, we focus on the social interaction phobia scale as our kind of primary social anxiety outcome measure. If you're familiar with this, it's a combination of the best performing items from the social phobia scale and the social interaction anxiety scale. And as you can imagine, we also administer the measures of fears of negative. The brief fear of negative evaluation scale is straightforward, and we also use the fear of positive evaluation scale. And then in the special issue that's coming out, we actually propose a novel scale where we combine the items from the brief fear of negative evaluation scale and the fear of positive evaluation scale into a single measure. So that would be something else that could be of interest to folks. And I'm happy to share any of these measures if you don't have copies. I'll give my email address at the end of the talk. So looking at our kind of like overall clinical battery, we've had about 230 patients complete this thus far. And there's cutoff scores that have been established for all of these measures. And interestingly, the fear of positive evaluation scale actually has the highest sensitivity for social anxiety disorder, with 91% of our patients exceeding that cutoff when they receive the diagnosis of social anxiety disorder. This isn't too surprising that the brief fear of negative evaluation scale, that less patients with the diagnosis meet that cutoff, in part because fear of negative evaluation is a more transdiagnostic factor that kind of is relevant for lots of different anxiety disorders. But it's interesting that the highest sensitivity was for the fear of positive evaluation scale, kind of highlighting the utility of it for screening purposes. And so why do socially anxious patients fear positive evaluation? It really seems to come down to this sense of sort of being in the spotlight in a positive way. And we know that social anxiety patients tend to experience thoughts such as these when they do feel in that way. These are items from the Concerns of Social Reprisal scale, which is a measure that was developed to better understand fear of positive evaluation. So there's this consistent theme where it seems like if they're doing well and other people are recognizing it, especially if it's people they don't know very well, then it feels as if people are going to feel like their toes are getting stepped on and they're going to get upset with them. This is based on a social dominance hierarchy model. This is kind of where the fear of positive evaluation actually emerged. So socially anxious individuals tend to perceive social situations in the context of a dominance hierarchy, where it's like popularity could be one way of thinking of this hierarchy. And so socially anxious individuals essentially see themselves as falling towards the bottom of this hierarchy. They kind of see other people as having more social power and social esteem and attractiveness, for example. And with this, there comes two really interesting and mutually different circumstances that can come from being at the bottom of this group. So one is that if you move any further down in social rank, you might actually be sort of like ostracized from the group. You might be excluded and not let back in. And this is where fear of negative evaluation comes from, is that you're going to lose your social resources even further and basically be outcast. But the other possibility is a really interesting one, and it's that to move up in social rank, to essentially gain more positive self-esteem or positive esteem from your colleagues and peers, you're actually going to be kind of like taking some of that social power potentially that those above you in social rank hold. And this is going to possibly cause them to resist that and reprise you for it. And so this is essentially like a resource competition model of social anxiety, with the resource being social attention holding power or popularity or any kind of like positive social variable that you can think of. And so it's this path that drives fear of positive evaluation conceptually. And then between these two concerns, these two consequences, socially anxious individuals literally feel trapped, where it's like they can't stand out positively, they don't want to stand out negatively, so they basically try to be invisible and they try to like be flies on the wall. And that's why so often they can go unnoticed in situations that they fear. What do folks think about this? Does anyone have any questions or comments?
I have a question,
Sure, go for it.
Schmolfischler. So does it ultimately then lead, like, if I'm afraid of the positive and some of these things wind up, it's negative that I'm taking away someone else's, doesn't all roads then lead to then being the negative response because I'm taking away someone's thunder? Like,
So it could lead to that negative response, but it's due to a concern that they're going to stand out positively. It's like a retaliation for being popular. It's a retaliation for being impressive.
right, which will
Yeah.
then be a stepping stone to then, I guess my question is, will I eventually be, I'm afraid of reducing in social rank because I doing something that for most people is positive, but is being perceived as negative.
So I would say I get what you're saying because there's a negative consequence to it.
Right.
But the difference is that it's like you're getting kind of like slapped back down to the bottom of the hierarchy if you try and stand out positively. And so it's for being impressive that you have that retaliation. But ultimately, the concern is, yeah, that you're going to get some kind of like negative social consequence, but it's for standing out positively.
Got it. Got it. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have a parallel question to Shmuel. I'm Larry. Uh, you mentioned in passing that the fear that positive evaluation raises the bar, in other words, raises other people's expectations and therefore increases anxiety to a socially anxious person, that they won't be able to meet those heightened
Right.
expectations, which would then lead to negative evaluation. I mean, that's what I hear most commonly from my clients who indicate fear of positive evaluation. Although, candidly, I haven't been asking them about this competition thing that you're raising, so that may be there too. But you dismiss that, and I'm not sure as convoluted, and I don't know quite why.
Yeah, I absolutely think that the raising of the bar concern is also a component to it. And we've known about that since the landmark studies of like Wallace and Alden back in the 1990s, where it's like socially anxious people know that they feel uncomfortable when they get positive feedback. We've known that for a long time. Um, I would also say that this kind of goes back to that lack of insight, where it's like they don't realize that they're afraid of it for this reason necessarily, but the more you probe into it, it is there. And uh, I've developed, along with colleagues, including Dr. Wilmer and our mentor, Dr. Rick Heimberg, we've developed a treatment protocol that focuses directly on fear positive evaluation. And part of that actually focuses on cognitive restructuring, focusing expressly upon this concern of like social reprisal for standing out in a positive light. And patients find it helpful as long as you're focusing on it directly.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Great question. Great discussion. As they keep coming up, please feel free to jump in. And so basically, the bivalent fear of evaluation model posits that these fears of both positive and negative evaluation are kind of co-core cognitive elements of social anxiety. And then in response to positive feedback, there's lots of evidence that has already been published, but also continues to emerge, showing that fear of positive evaluation relates uniquely with regards to fear of negative evaluation to cognitive and behavioral and emotional and physiological and neurobiological responses to social threats that are distinct from those of fear of negative evaluation. But in a lot of ways, they are parallel because they all relate to concerns of social, essentially like being rejected and outcast or otherwise reprised. And so I kind of want to walk through just some of the most interesting of these for you, kind of step by step. In terms of cognitive responses to social threat, we definitely have the most evidence of this. Is there a big red line on my screen?
There is, I think it was an accidental annotation. You
That's
might
what,
be able to clear it if you click on the three dots and say clear.
oh, let me see. I don't know if I know how to do that. So is that distracting if I leave it there? Is it going to be there for all the slides, do you think? I've
It
never
will be
seen
there for all the slides, but that's okay.
it. Sorry.
Oh, there it goes again.
What? I don't know why it's doing that.
It's because annotations aren't
What,
disabled,
should
which
I
is
should I clear this? Should I stop the share mode to do that?
actually, yeah, maybe just stop sharing and then share again, and then we can disable annotations.
Sorry, folks. This should just take a second. Yeah, looks like that took care of it. So hopefully that doesn't repeat. And so I was saying we have the most evidence of how fear
Oh, and
positive.
sorry, Justin, we can't see your, it looks like they're not sharing on our screen.
Oops. Okay. Let's try that again. Have to love technical glitches.
Mm-hmm. Perfect.
Okay.
All right, we got it now.
All right. What would Zoom be without some technical problems?
Exactly.
And so we definitely by far have the most evidence of how fear positive evaluation relates uniquely to cognitive responses to social threat. Some of the ones that stand out the most strongly are concerns of social reprisal for standing out in a positive light, and also disqualification of positive social outcomes. And so we all know about the tendency for socially anxious individuals to disqualify the positive. From the fear of positive evaluation perspective, we actually we perceive disqualifying the positive as a safety behavior. And so if it is threatening to receive public positive adulation, then the best thing you could do to kind of like protect yourself from that would be to push back on it and downplay it and suggest that you don't deserve it, because that's going to essentially appease those who are kind of like higher in the hierarchy. That's going to make it feel like their toes are not getting stepped on. And there's some evidence of this that I'll kind of tap into in a little bit. From a behavioral standpoint, one of my favorite examples of this has come from some eye tracking work that we've done. And this was done with my colleagues, Ashley Howell, Akanksha Srivastava, and Philippe Golden. And this was a study we did where we used eye tracking to assess where people were looking at these dynamic video clips that we asked our participants to imagine that they were in the situation where they were actually receiving the feedback in person. And so this was social anxiety disorder patients and healthy controls who were demographically matched. And we did this covertly. And so we were using a head tracker to track their vision, but they didn't know that we were tracking their vision. We told them that it was a camera. And I can answer questions about that if you have them. But this was actually a replication and extension study from one that we published back in 2013 in depression and anxiety. And so of most relevance to this talk, I want to show an example of a video clip from the positive group.
You seem very smart.
And so all the clips are 12 seconds in duration. And I'm going to show you an example of, so the red X is from one patient. It's the actual tracking of where their vision was during the viewing of the video clip. Let me take a moment to load here. Oh, darn, it's not working. Is it working on anybody else's screen? I tested this out yesterday and it was working.
We could see the first one, but this one doesn't look like it's playing.
Bummer. Well, as you can imagine, the X is falling within the eye region. And you can see the boxes that we drew around the eyes in order to assess where their gaze was. And let's see. Yeah, I don't know why it's not working. Oh no.
Uh-oh, did the whole thing freeze?
Yes. Oh my gosh.
That's okay. Do you want to try stop sharing again and then reshare?
Yeah.
That might help it.
Yeah, that's what I'll do.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, folks.
The best laid plans, right?
Right? Well, as you can imagine, and I'll show you some data. We don't need the fancy graphics for that. And as you can imagine, the socially anxious patients had as hard a time holding eye contact with our positive video actors as they did with the negative video actors. And the actors did both types, by the way. So it's like they were watching the same people delivering different kinds of feedback. So it couldn't have been like actor specific, essentially. Give me just 1 second. Any questions while I'm reloading this here?
I have a general question.
Please.
I'm curious, what you make of the low insight into fear of positive evaluation. If it's just sort of less salient because it's less socially understandable in general in our culture, or if there are other things that might be contributing.
I think that's part of it, that it's less intuitive. I think when patients try to explain it, like initially, as they're feeling it, that folks had a hard time. It's like, it doesn't seem to make sense unless you think of it from like a social dominance hierarchy standpoint in some ways. And most people don't think of, they don't like to think that people operate in that kind of capacity, right? It's like we'd rather not live in a world where that is the kind of mentality. And so I think it's partly that they've tried to explain it before to people and they haven't really understood it. I think another part of it is that they do learn to avoid it, and they do so successfully that it sort of ceases to be something that they think about, if that makes sense.
Yeah, maybe it's easier. It's like it's easier to avoid, and maybe it's less impairing to avoid positive evaluation versus avoiding
It might, I would say in the short term, it definitely
In the
would.
short term. Right. In the
Yeah.
moment, but certainly not in
Yep,
the long term.
exactly.
Okay. Thank you. That's really
Similar
interesting.
to how I've talked to lots of panickers who don't connect conceptually the fear of like being caught in traffic with being like out of control or like not in control of that situation. But once you
Hmm.
explain it, they get it and it makes a lot of sense to them. I've also talked to lots of socially anxious folks who have a hard time explaining why they're concerned about blushing. It's like we as mental health providers know about like self-consciousness and how that can lead to the blushing response for some people. And it's like they don't really know it until you arm them with the information, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
So I hope that answered your
Yeah,
question.
it does. Thank you.
Absolutely. And so, yeah, here you can see the data. I'm sorry about the technical glitches with the videos, but it is really cool because you can actually see the difficulty holding eye contact with even the actors in the positive clips. And as you can see here, our social anxiety patients had actually even more difficulty holding eye contact with the actors who were delivering the positive feedback than they did with the negative feedback. And you can also see that the healthy controls held more eye contact with both actors in both conditions, and more so than the social anxiety patients. And we also see the same effect with number of eye fixations. And so this is like our eye tracker, like determining when you lock on to a specific part of the video field, essentially. And so I think this is a really great example of how we all know that a lot of people with social anxiety struggle with eye contact. And here we can see that it's equally difficult for folks, regardless of whether it's positive or negative. And then in terms of emotional and physiological, there's quite a bit of data out there in terms of like SUDS ratings and negative affect, for example. But I think this is a really neat study I did with my colleague Peggy Zakola at Ohio University. And here, what we did is we had college students deliver a speech in the way of a modified social Trier social stress test. So, for those of you familiar with this, it's like what you're trying to do is present yourself as an ideal candidate for a hypothetical job. And we didn't give them any negative feedback in response to this. So, this is essentially like a pure, kind of a pure positive evaluation exposure. And what we found, one of the findings we got from this study was that fear of positive evaluation prior to the speech task led to an increase in state anxiety prior to the speech itself, and that this in turn had a dampening effect on positive affect they experienced during the speech. And so this is a significant mediational effect, and it suggests that social anxiety, we know that it is associated with various positivity impairments. Um, Todd Kajdan's work, for example, has shown that social anxiety is associated with positive affect deficits even after controlling statistically for depression. And this suggests that FPE could account for this in part, possibly from a causal perspective. And this makes sense intuitively because if you fear positive evaluation, it's probably going to make you feel less good while you're engaged socially. And we've also seen lots of connections with state anxiety. We do tend to see a more strong connection between fear of negative evaluation and negative affect. And we do tend to see a more consistent relationship between fear of positive evaluation and reduced positive affect in social anxiety research. And then we also saw that high fear of positive evaluation was associated with a significantly greater increase in heart rate from a relaxation period to actually during the speech itself. So again, kind of highlighting these unique relationships. And this was after accounting for a fear of negative evaluation as well. And then we also replicated and extended these findings in a separate study. And then what about neurobiological findings? So I've been involved in a couple of studies that have examined fMRI data with social anxiety patients, and I've looked at fears of positive and negative evaluation. Unfortunately, the findings from those studies, as often happens with neuroimaging, haven't been super well replicated. And the best study I would say that I've come across for this is actually one that has been put forth by Zhang and colleagues out of China and Australia. And what they did is they actually had hundreds of individuals undergo a resting fMRI and then they had them complete a battery of surveys, which they then had them complete again 2 years later. And so what they found was that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, there was reduced activity in that area of the brain that was then associated with increased fear of negative evaluation, which then led to increased social anxiety 2 years later. And that increased activity in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex was associated with increased fear of positive evaluation, which then caused social anxiety at time 2 years later. And with this relationship between fear of negative evaluation and fear of positive evaluation being significant and positive, that's been seen many, many times in the literature. And I find this really interesting, not only because I expect it's going to replicate better because there's a lot more individuals who took part in the study. There's at least 650 participants in the first wave of the study. And I believe that like 400 of those completed the time 2 data. So lots of better chances that it's going to replicate than these like clinical studies that tend to look at like 20 participants per group. But what's really interesting here is the conceptual stuff. So the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is known to regulate distress in social settings. And it's particularly related to sensitivity to rejection, which we would think is very related to fear of negative evaluation, given that dominance model we talked about before, where it's like, it literally seems conceptually connected to the concern that you might get pushed out of a group. And then the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is involved in implicit emotion regulation. And it's very crucial for decision making that balances rewards and costs. So it makes a lot of sense to me that this would connect to fear of positive evaluation, because fear of positive evaluation is about balancing, not reaching for too many rewards because of the concern of the social costs and getting pushed back down in the hierarchy, so to speak. And so I think this is a really interesting line of research, and conceptually it makes a lot of sense that these areas would be involved. To go back to the question of like, why is there less insight into this? I also think a big part of that is that it is more instinctual than conceptual. I think these fears have probably been a part of our species for evolutionary reasons. It's like there's a lot of parallels to non-human primates and how they interact in terms of a dominance hierarchy, for example. And so I think it's so instinctual that it's something that doesn't really make sense from as much of a like cognitive standpoint. I think it's driven by fear, and people don't really understand it as well. So interesting neurobiological stuff there. And so what are the clinical implications of this work? We could talk about the research implications of it, but what are the clinical implications? First of all, I would recommend administering the fear positive evaluation scale if this isn't something that you tend to kind of focus on with your patients. We do have this well-established cutoff score of 22, and it's pretty easy to score. You basically just score the straightforward items, which are items 1 through 4 and 6 through 9. And if the score is above 22, that suggests clinically severe fear positive evaluation. And that would give you an indication that you'd want to attend to that in your treatment. How would you do that? By focusing on these really nice positive exposure opportunities that our patients really do tend to avoid and don't even necessarily realize that they're avoiding them in that way. A lot of times you hear folks say that they don't get the positive feedback, and so it's not very anxious, it's not very anxiety provoking for them. But if you ask patients if they tend to display their talents and their impressive qualities, for example, the answer is almost universally no, that they don't do that, and that they try to hide them whenever they can. And so to try and frame it for them that they're basically depriving themselves of the social rewards that you get from allowing yourself to stand up positively, you can help your patients better achieve their social goals, even if they don't realize that that's something that they would want to do. And again, if fear positive evaluation does result in this dampening of positive affect, it's actually going to make them feel better and more rewarded when they do exposure work and when they are doing the things that are more typically done in CBT for social anxiety, for example. And I'll talk a little bit more about like specific exposures in just a moment. But basically, we can expect the same results from exposure work as we see for fear of negative evaluation-oriented exposures. And on that note, Dr. Wilmer and I collaborated on a proof of principle randomized controlled trial, along with other colleagues of ours at Temple University, including our mentor, Rick Heimberg. And this was examining a really brief 2-session CBT protocol that directly targeted fear of positive evaluation. And this is something we offered to patients at the Adult Anxiety Clinic at Temple while they were awaiting long-term social anxiety treatment, CBT for social anxiety. So this was something to kind of give them a resource while waiting for longer-term treatment to get started. And what we found was that there were large reductions in both fear of positive evaluation in just this 2.5-hour protocol, as well as social anxiety in general, using that social interaction phobia scale I mentioned before. And so I don't know about you all, but during the pandemic, our waiting lists exploded. And in our department of psychology here at Nebraska Medicine, we literally had over 200 patients on our waiting list after we put in restrictions to prevent it from growing even further for years. And we're still having trouble to catch up because we know, I mean, with social anxiety in particular, that was reinforced by the pandemic, and lots of people have had a hard time getting reintroduced socially into the community. But in general, waiting lists, I know, are a problem everywhere. Like they became more of a problem during the pandemic, and many clinics are still having that problem. They're still trying to catch up. And so we've been implementing a lot of groups to try to like stem the tide and try to help give folks some resources while they wait. And so here at Nebraska Medicine and our anxiety clinic, we've actually taken this protocol and turned it into a group. And it's something we've done relatively more new, but we've had 10 patients take part. And interestingly, I thought as a social anxiety group, most folks would want to take part by Zoom, but most of our patients have actually wanted to take part in person. And what we see is a clinically significant, statistically significant reduction of fear positive evaluation. And this is something that we offer into 3 to 4 sessions, depending on whether patients feel like they're ready to terminate by session number 3. And we're also seeing a reduction in social anxiety, and like more broadly speaking. But basically what this involves is exposures of 2 types. One is receiving and accepting compliments. So not disqualifying the positive, and basically we work out that when they get a compliment from someone, that instead of saying something like, oh, it's not a big deal, or oh, I didn't really work that hard or whatever, they instead have to say something like, thank you, that means a lot to me. And the other type of exposure is displaying talents. So lots of social anxiety patients I've learned are musicians, but don't ever play their music publicly. Lots of them are artists and don't share their work. They don't post it on social media. Lots of them are photographers, for example, don't like to show people what they love to do. And you can imagine the impact at a person's job. It's like not giving ideas, not essentially doing the things that most of us would think we were encouraged to do. And so I would encourage you all to start looking for those opportunities with your own patients. And if you're not already doing so, and really encouraging them to be in that positive spotlight. And they will habituate the same way that they do for fear of negative evaluation. And so I hope this has been an illuminating talk. I really look forward to any questions and conversation that might come from here. And I do want to share my email address in case anybody wants to consult on this after the talk today, or if you want to get resources from me or articles, I would love to share those. And so please take this down if you're interested and follow up with me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We can open it up for questions if folks have questions they'd like to ask.
I have another question. This is Larry again.
Please.
In a recent slide, you indicated that your brief therapy for fear of positive evaluation led not only to a large reduction in the fear of positive evaluation, but social anxiety generally. So
Yes.
just to be clear, so are you saying the evidence shows that targeting fear of positive evaluation through those two types of exposures also somehow reduces their fear of negative evaluation? And if so, do you understand why?
That's a really great question. I haven't looked at that specifically because we just looked at social anxiety broadly. So, I mean, this is in terms of what the fears of positive and negative evaluation are, technically, like according to the literature, they're considered cognitive components to anxiety, whereas social anxiety is the emotional reaction. And so when we see a reduction in the SIPS score, it's an indication that their anxiety is lessening. And then I would say that that's because their fear of positive evaluation, which is a cognitive component, is reducing. And so it's reducing the emotional component as well. I haven't looked at whether it reduces fear of negative evaluation, but that would be really interesting. I could see that being the case, but I didn't look at that yet. But research does tend to show that fears of evaluation are causal to social anxiety, like to the emotional reactions. Because the idea, maybe potentially oversimplistically, is that if you're not concerned about evaluation, then you're probably not going to feel the anxiety response. Although there are some patients who will say that they aren't concerned about evaluation. So I would say that that would be my kind of like causal explanation of how reducing positive evaluation fears is going to lead to reduced social anxiety. Part of the thinking here, by the way, I didn't mention this, but we usually are suggesting that our patients engage in exposures that are easier to do first, right? That are less anxiety provoking. And social anxiety patients almost universally will say, at least at first, that it seems like positive evaluation oriented exposures are going to be easier than those that involve negative evaluation. So it makes a lot of sense to kind of front load CBT that's going to focus on fear of negative evaluation with these exposures that focus on fear of positive evaluation. But I can tell you that the SUDS ratings I get for having a patient play their guitar for people that they've never played it before, or share their artwork with people they've never shared it with, or reading poetry that they've written and never wanted to let anybody else experience, their SUDS ratings will get as high or higher than they would expect when it's a negative evaluation context, which is, I always think, really interesting, of course.
Thank you.
But it seems more palatable at first. Yeah.
I had sort of I guess, observation that I haven't thought of before when learning about this. And I think there's sort of a related question, but it seems like, with negative evaluation, most people, non-socially anxious people don't love that either, right? But socially anxious people, right? It's just an exaggerated response to that if I'm oversimplifying. But with positive evaluation, I think most non-anxious people, non-socially anxious people really like that. It's not, it's actually like an opposite reaction or opposite response. And so I'm thinking about, like the hierarchical model. And is it that most people, non-socially anxious people, when they get that positive feedback, even if they're aware they're moving up the hierarchy, that's not seen as threatening, or like they're not afraid of the conflict? Is it the conflict element? Because I just think it's interesting. It's really an opposite response. It's not just an exaggerated, right?
No, I agree. I think that's a really great observation. It's like, I think that's all, it's another reason that there's less insight to this, is that if a socially anxious person is trying to explain a fear of positive evaluation to a non-socially anxious person, it's like, to them, they don't understand what they're saying.
Right, exactly.
I don't get it.
Yeah.
I think some people just feel like they keep hitting that wall and they just like lose the ability to explain it, or they just like stop trying.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. I based a lot of this on Paul Gilbert's work, who came up with some really great psychoevolutionary models of social anxiety. And his model is that non-socially anxious people are operating from a cooperative mode, in which case positive feedback is good because it means you're getting rewards and you're doing better socially. The idea is that socially anxious people operate from a competitive mode, and that's why they see things in terms of a hierarchy. Of course, we can all see things like from a hierarchical perspective when we try, but the idea is that non-socially anxious people just don't see why this would be a threat. because there's enough resources to go around. Like people can be popular and it shouldn't be a concern for the most part to others. But that's a great observation. Other questions or comments?
I'm curious if you would share maybe some more specifics about the types of exposures that you set up to target, both in that sort of like pre-treatment exposure group, but then also other things that you've done just in general treatment with people with social anxiety to
Yeah,
target fear of positive evaluation.
yeah. A lot of them initially can focus on, like, it's very rare to encounter a social anxiety patient, in my experience, who doesn't have a hidden talent or hobby that they enjoy and want to share, but they don't. And so I usually start there because it's like honestly one of the easiest things they can do. And then it does result in positive evaluation, which is anxiety provoking, but it also helps them to kind of tap more into reward in those social situations. But then I basically start to look for any situation where they're trying to be invisible, in which they think that they could stand out in a more positive way. So for students, actually we offer a pediatric version of this group as well. So it's something we're doing with kids as well as adults. And it's like the number of students who will tell you, who are socially anxious, that they are positive they know answers to questions, but they don't answer them. And it's because they don't want to stand out as in that positive light. They don't want to look like they know everything. And it's like that is a wonderful exposure opportunity for any students, whether they're in elementary school, high school, or college. Lots of folks will not volunteer ideas they have at work when they're in meetings, even if they think that they would be appreciated, or they'll try to do it more anonymously or more, in a way that doesn't get them credit for it. That's another really easy opportunity. And then a lot of people who are socially anxious will tell you that it's like they have this isn't a surprise. A lot of these patients have great senses of humor, but it's like they don't want to tell jokes, even if they think people will think they're funny. So just kind of like making that a goal for them. And you can set these things as really objective, like exposure goals, and send them out in the world, and they can do them and come back and tell you that they're less anxious about it and that they were glad they did it.
Yeah, I love those. I love that. I haven't thought of the joke one before, and that I feel like you could do that in session, you could do that out of session.
Yeah,
That's really fun.
absolutely.
We had a question come in. About whether it's been developed into a group protocol, and it sounds like I think you mentioned that was in the works, and I'm curious what that looks like doing this in a group, and if you've seen any differences between
Yes.
doing it individually as well.
So it is in a protocol in the sense that basically what I did is I took the individual protocol that Dr. Wilmer and I collaborated on with our other colleagues at Temple, and I've created slides and put a lot of the material into the notes section. So it's like as you're leading it, you can literally refer to the information in the notes section to guide the session content. So that is available. And if anyone of you are interested, I would be happy to share that with you all, because it's something I'm interested to get out there and get patients help for. And it also, as you can imagine, since it socializes them to CBT, helps get them ready for doing, it's like we use the Managing Social Anxiety protocol, which is 16 sessions, and it really kind of like gets them ready to jump into that and hit the ground running, so to speak.
That's great. That sounds fantastic.
Yeah.
And it's interesting too. What I love about it is that it gets people straight to exposures, whereas so often in traditional CBT protocols, it's
I know.
weeks of psychoeducation and cognitive work. Do you feel like folks are able to tolerate that? Does it go well?
Yeah, it does. We focus on like these concerns that if I stand out, it's going to cause others to get upset with me, and that it can essentially cause friction to stand out in a positive light. And so there's some more, it's cognitive restructuring at a level that makes sense for a group format, and it arms them with rational responses as they go out and do these exposures. And yeah, you're absolutely right. As I'm sure you all know, exposure work doesn't usually start till session 7, according to the Managing Social Anxiety protocol. And I've tried to do it faster. It does not work well they really seem to need 6 sessions or so to build up to the possibility. But maybe because these are less intimidating, patients seem able to do them more quickly, and it seems to help.
I've done the complements exercise, not even knowing about your bivalent model, but just as a group building exercise, because
Nice.
it is a standard group building exercise, even in non-CBT stuff. And boy, is that challenging for people,
Yes.
it just evokes really good discussion. I have a general question. Do you approach these exposures in the traditional exposure model of aiming toward habituation, or are you also using them as behavioral experiments to gain evidence challenging anxious thoughts? In which case, how do you do the latter for fear of positive evaluation?
I mostly look at them as a habituation exposure, like opportunity. But then in some cases, people will say they have hot cognitions that someone is going to reprise them for doing these things. And in that sense, it does provide some objective data because if someone is worried that they're going to give an idea in a group setting or answer the question correctly in class, they may think people are going to make fun of them or that they're going to slight them somehow. And so then they'll come back and say that didn't happen. And it's like instead, people seem to really appreciate it and say I should bring my suggestions to the table more often. And it seems to go well in that sense. So I'd say it's both.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And I saw that chat question.
Yeah, I was just going to say we got one in the chat.
So
Socially anxious clients have a fear of negative evaluation. Do all socially anxious clients have the fear of positive evaluation?
there isn't, I can say we've done taxometric analyses that show it's not just a subset of individuals who have the fear of positive evaluation. They do seem to be really like hand in hand components. And so it's like if you think of the bivalent model, it's like as both fears increase, we get to like social anxiety more and more. And it's so I'm sure there are some patients who will even say they don't have fear of negative evaluation. So I wouldn't say that all of them have it, but it's like I would assume socially anxious patients do have it. Unless, yeah, the measure suggests otherwise, or you just explore it and it just doesn't seem to happen. Just like there's some panickers who don't have any claustrophobia, don't have any concerns about certain situations that panickers tend to.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
I'm mindful of time and I can see people are having to hop for sessions and other meetings, but I wanted to just say thank you so much for speaking with us today. It was really educational and helpful and a really great conversation as well. So thank you.
the feeling is mutual. Thanks so much for having me. And if anyone wants to follow up with me, please do so.